Without a doubt, if there is one flavor this geopolitical season, it is the US President-elect Donald Trump and his controversial statements. Trump has once again emphasized that reciprocity will be the cornerstone of his administration's trade policy. Now, this sentiment was recently echoed by his Commerce Secretary pick Howard Lutnick. And hours after the statement, the US Ambassador to India, Garcetti, also reiterated that India has the highest tariffs among major economies. Now, these repeated assertions have understandably caused speculation in New Delhi, given that Washington is among its largest trading partners and a country with which it enjoys a very high trade surplus. In fact, USA is India's highest trade surplus relationship. Naturally, how does Trump view trade reciprocity is something that fundamentally concerns India. Trump is an unabashed advocate of tariffs, often describing them as beautiful. Historically, Republican administrations have been viewed favorably in New Delhi, considered less intrusive and more accommodating in comparison to the condescending approach taken by the Democrats. The overall bilateral optimism, however, has been tempered by recent points of contention. For example, the controversy around Sikh separatist Guru Patwant Singh Pannu, the Hindenburg report targeting Gautam Adani, and the alleged attempts by George Soros to sow instability in India. These issues, combined with the persistent influence of the deep state theory, have often diverted India's attention from structural challenges which demand more of India's strategic time and analysis. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar recently critiqued the outdated anti-Westernism prevalent in India, and he argued that such attitudes fail to align with changing geopolitical realities and areas of convergence. Now, trade with the US remains India's most promising avenue for sustaining an export surplus in goods and services. It also helps address its growing trade deficit with both China and Russia, especially as free trade agreements with the European Union and the one with the United Kingdom remain stalled. India also aims to capitalize on the US's efforts to de-risk from China, a move underscored recently by Trump's threats of a 60% tariff and other trade restrictions against Beijing as he will take office on 20th of January next year. Now, let me give you a bit on how India's trade decisions have been missing the woods for the trees. India has been successfully rerouting global trade without successfully integrating into global value chains that could bring tangible benefits to strengthening domestic manufacturing or adding any made in India value. The country's economic ambitions are often undermined by contradictions arising from its attempts to balance international pressures with insufficient domestic policy reforms. And when I say contradictions, 3 examples come to mind, and I'll tell you all 3 one by one. First, let me tell you about the smart moves, such as India's imports of huge volumes of discounted Russian oil that we refine and re-export to Europe at good profits. Now, this has created a tactical and favorable trade balance for India with the EU. Although this comes at the cost of a ballooning trade deficit between India and Russia, nonetheless, this rerouting benefits all parties: India, the EU, and the global oil supply stability, as well as Russia, although it reduces Russian hydrocarbon revenues according to data. However, broader trade opportunities expected from the free trade agreement with the EU remain stymied due to misconceptions around, say, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM, which is perceived as a non-starter by Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal and his team. And in the coming week, I will get back with a more detailed analysis on CBAM and its discontent. Coming back to the contradictions, this pragmatic oil strategy contrasts sharply with India's circumvention of sanctions to export the common high priority list items to Russia, or the CHP list items. Now, this yields no real benefit to Indian manufacturing and doesn't give Indian exporters any real profit. Most of these supplies are routed via third parties, with India acting as a middleman to simply resell Western origin products to a heavily sanctioned Russia at a small profit. Now, the point I wish to underscore is that unlike oil rerouting, which strategically capitalizes on geopolitical upheavals and vulnerabilities, CHP re-exporting reveals a rather myopic approach. This can unnecessarily jeopardize India's relationships with all its major trading and investment partners such as the US, the EU, the UK, as well as the Netherlands, and expose Indian exporters to coordinated sanctions by all these entities. Now, you'll ask me, why did I take these 4 countries specifically? It is because as of now, these are the trading partners with whom India has the biggest trade surplus. Now, second is the paradox of de-risking. As global electronics and machinery manufacturing shifts to India, our imports from China have also surged. This raises questions about the efficacy of global efforts at de-risking, and it also highlights India's over-reliance on Chinese industrial goods. Now, if you look at the recently released report by the Global Trade Research Initiative, or the GTRI, it reveals that almost 98.5% of India's imports from China, that amount to about 50 billion US dollars, are industrial goods, with China supplying 30% of India's total industrial imports. With this kind of dependence, where really is the de-risking happening? To reduce dependence, India must invest significantly in deep manufacturing to produce critical industrial products domestically. Otherwise, the country's exports to the West will only deepen its reliance on Chinese imports. Therefore, the real question is how to bring investment. And that brings me to the third example. That is the investment dilemma in India. Attributing our internal economic challenges to external forces like the favorite punching bag of the deep state overlooks critical structural issues. Recent trends show that foreign institutional investors, or the FIIs, are offloading Indian holdings at unprecedented levels. They are redirecting funds to China, where equity markets are perceived as more affordable. Now, at least some sources seem to suggest that. The worrisome part is this could be a part of a broader trend of declining investor confidence in an overvalued Indian market compared to other emerging economies. And the other area where we see a direct impact of a declining investor confidence are the FDI flows. The net foreign direct investment, or the FDI, into India has also been declining for years. In fact, if you take a look at the Reserve Bank of India data from earlier this year, it revealed a 62% drop in net FDI, down to about $10.6 billion in financial year 2024, and this has been the lowest since 2007. What makes this tad more worrisome is that even as the West emphasizes de-risking from China, investments bypassing China have not flown to India, but have instead diverted to countries like Vietnam and Singapore. So the China plus one is not working in India's favor yet. So despite political rhetoric, these developments point to systemic problems within India's investment ecosystem, including regulatory bottlenecks, lack of investment guarantees, and uncompetitive frameworks. Without addressing these structural challenges and embracing sensible quid pro quo strategies, India's ambitions of becoming a global manufacturing hub will remain sluggish. Now, let me come back to the beginning, which is why Trump's love for tariffs matters. During his last term, Donald Trump made trade wars a defining feature of his economic policies by imposing higher tariffs on its trading partners like China, the EU, as well as on India. Now, as he prepares for a second term, he has already announced plans to levy tariffs on imports from Mexico, which is 16% of US trade, Canada, which is 14% of US trade, and China, which is 11% of US trade. And Mexico, Canada, and China are the top 3 trading partners of the US. Now, just for comparison, India accounts for about 2% of US's total international trade. So, from the perspective of these 3, Mexico, Canada, and China, the stakes are significant. According to the World Bank, the United States is the destination for about 78% of Mexico's total exports, 77% of Canada's total exports, and 16% of China's total exports. Now, what is important to note is that the tariffs imposed on China during Trump's first term actually enabled Mexico to surpass the former as the US's top trading partner, a trend that Biden administration continued with. So what is the takeaway? The takeaway is economic policies of the world's largest economy inevitably shape global trade flows, even as the US grapples with its own vulnerabilities. The Federal Reserve's recent adjustments, in the US, so those recent adjustments to its 2025 projections signal a cautious monetary approach in the US. These have already added to global pressure, particularly on emerging market currencies. Now, how to assess that impact on India? For example, the Indian rupee recently fell by a 12 paise to an all-time low of 85.06 against the US dollar because of these 2025 projections. So what does all this tell us about India's trade policy? Now, India has traditionally maintained high tariffs to protect its local industries, which are often less competitive compared to the quality of goods produced abroad. Now, this is the policy which is referred to as protectionism, and this protectionism has remained consistent across recent years. Now, to give you how it works in recent times, I'll give you a few figures. Now, in the 2021-2022 annual budget, India raised tariffs on about 31 product categories. Next year, tariffs were increased on additional imported goods such as headphones and speakers, etc. And yet again, in 2023-2024 budget, tariffs were again hiked on items like plastic, goods, jewelry, private jets, and if you go to the list is pretty long. Now you know why India is called a champion of high tariffs, because it wants to protect its own markets. But simultaneously, and here's the paradox, India has also been negotiating the reinstatement of its Generalized System of Preferences status, or the GSP status. This GSP status was revoked during Trump's first term. Now, the GSP program, which was initiated in the early 1970s, is a US trade policy designed to promote global trade by offering preferential tariff-free access to goods from developing countries. Now, India enjoyed the GSP benefits all the way until 2019, when, as I told you, the first Trump administration revoked them after conducting a review of India's compliance with market access criteria. Despite multiple attempts to restore the GSP status, including very recent discussions between Piyush Goyal and his US counterpart, it could not be restored under the Biden administration. The prospects look even bleaker under Trump unless India agrees to give massive concessions to make the India-US bilateral trade fairer, by which I mean, I think, more market access. The narrative that Donald Trump will address the perceived strategic shortcomings of the Biden administration resonates strongly in India. Many in the Indian commentariat trust Trump's ability to confront the deep state and bring about a resolution to all world's problems, including the long-standing Russia-Ukraine war. In fact, this statement is echoed quite internationally, with a Ukrainian MP even nominating Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize. Interesting. Various stakeholders anticipate structural changes when Trump returns to office in January, though their expectations are shaped by differing priorities and interests. From the perspective of India, however, India-US bilateral ties are going to get more transactional. New Delhi will have to concede more benefits to Washington, with a likely shrunk space for strategic autonomy and multi-alignment. Now, whether India is able to reach a favorable quid pro quo is something that we will learn in the new year. Before that, I will be back to discuss more on India's trade policy, investment bottlenecks, and the stuck FTAs. Stay tuned.